Hi everybody, welcome to A Drink with the Idler. I get to ask you to unmute in a second, but first of all, I'm Victoria Hull. We've got Lola Shoniyan here, we've got David Goodhart here, of course we've got our philosopher Mark Vernon here, and we've got the editor of the Idler, Tom Hodgkinson. Welcome to our special guests, and a special welcome to all of you, our drinkers. Do unmute and say hello and say where you are. We love seeing you all. Hi, everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Hello.
Hi.
They sound like ghosts in a.
Hey. So lovely to see you all. Lots of new people. Lots of our lovely regulars. That's absolutely super. We're going to hand on really quickly to Mark because we've got two special guests this week and we want to give lots of time for your questions at the end as well. So I'm going to hand over to Mark Vernon for this week's philosophy.
Thank you, Victoria, and hello, everybody. I thought I'd try and say something about place tonight. And by place, I mean not space. And I hope that will become clear. I think it might be a link, if somewhat tenuous, between our two speakers, so help launch the conversation and exchanges with them. But place is something which, of course, we're thinking about once more, certainly here in London, with lockdown tightening up once more. And I guess it's quite a global concern. So this difference between place and space, a place, if you like, is somewhere that has character, it has history, it has a feel, it even has spirits, it has all sorts of entities that might be lurking in it. Whereas a space is an abstract zone. It's usually marked out for utilitarian reasons, you know, so in modernist architecture, the function counts quite as much as the form, or a space is well equipped, you'd say, because it's got the right technology that you use. And so place and space are really quite different things. And the emergence of space as opposed to place is quite a modern thing. It lies behind actually much of the sort of progress of today, to mention that side, although I want to think particularly about how it gives rise to discontent as well. And to do that, to have the bit of philosophy is to have a quick dig again at poor old Descartes, not for Cartesian dualisms this time, which anyone who's done any philosophy will know is a good stone to throw in his direction, but to have a go at his coordinates, because it's Descartes that in a way gave rise to the imaginary that could conceive of space with his Cartesian coordinates, you know, the way that you can divide space up into X and Y using axes, and so plot and chart where something might be. The story is that he got very frustrated one day, lying in his bed, looking at a fly crawling across the ceiling. And Descartes was obsessed with order and giving form to things, being able to chart where they were, how they were, what they were doing. And the fly really frustrated him because it seemed to be just zigzagging across the ceiling in seeming random ways. And then he thought, if I write an x-axis down one side of the ceiling and a y-axis along the bottom, then I can chart where the fly is going, and in my mind at least, control it. And so Cartesian coordinates were born. Now, they led to huge advances in mathematics and then in engineering and in science more generally. But with this downside, that it led to the idea that nature itself could be simulated. You could simulate it, say, nowadays on a computer by mapping nature as if it were a space and not a living place. Machines could do this. And increasingly, machines started to be imagined as, well, first of all, nature itself as a kind of machine. Places began to be thought of as machine-like. And eventually, space takes over place in our imaginary. And then with that comes the sense that quantity might matter more than quality. You know, if places were states where qualities ruled, the qualities of character, of feel, of spirits. Spaces are where quantities rule, where X equals something and Y equals something and Z equals something. And it even infects how we treat people now, I think. And this perhaps is linking to the kinds of things our speakers might talk about. So, for example, I think one of the reasons why care workers get a hard time in our world is because what they do can't easily be quantified. Whereas bankers get well paid in our world because they can supremely quantify what they do. They can give you a figure at the end of a spreadsheet. And because we value quantity now, probably over quality, certainly when we think that we can give a figure to it, that spins off, and eventually bankers end up getting paid a whole lot more, in part simply because they can quantify what they do, whereas people like care workers can't. It carves up the world, of course, and you know, it does provide lots of utility and freedom space, from knowing that we live in a particular nation state to turning on our GPS when we want to get from A to B. The internet too, the dream of the internet is that this kind of undifferentiated space where just at a click we can go wherever we want to go. But of course, as Nietzsche pointed out, it also leaves us suspended in empty space with horizons removed, floating freely, not quite sure where we stand. And so gives rise to lots of discontent, psychological quite as much as practical, in relation, say, to where we live, what we're valued for, how we remunerate people, and so on. So it's just worth bearing in mind that there was a time when there was no space at all. It's a Renaissance word. People thought about where they lived in relation to places. And as we think about places now, and feel the constraint of where we're living, perhaps through lockdown, perhaps for other reasons, it's worth remembering, I think, as you take a walk in the sun and think, I'm in an actual place, and breathe it in and maybe find out about the history. As poetry can evoke places, as we can hear about the history of our life and times and realize that these imaginaries really profoundly change. And my sense is that part of the task that maybe now might be calling us to is to remember that things like place once shaped people's sense of where they were. They didn't think about it in terms of these empty spaces. They thought they were living and breathing in psychoactive zones rather than just parts of the world that could be pushed to this use or that use. And I wonder, Tom, whether this might be a theme that our speakers pick up tonight, but also, you know, as we live in times that feel constrained, it's worth remembering that, you know, we live in places that can give us things, that can give us a sense of being alive, even as we feel life might be, well, even under threat, but certainly something that we're having to wrestle and struggle with. Tom.
Thanks, Mark. As far as place goes, I am currently sitting underneath a motorway called the Westway in West London, looking out over some train tracks and a concrete factory. But I'm quite happy here. Victoria.
Yeah, well, I am sitting in the middle of West London, but which I'd much rather be somewhere rural, truth be known. And I spend a lot of time trying to make my small yard as rural as I possibly can. But our special guest poet Lola Shoniyan, in fact, I haven't pronounced that right, have I, Lola? Lola Shoniyan. We've been practicing it. She is in Lagos in Nigeria. And it's very cross-continental. I mean, you were educated, Lola, in Edinburgh as well as Nigeria, weren't you? What started the poetry?
I was, yeah. How did I actually start writing poetry?
Yes.
I think it was in university. Yeah, it was in uni. And we were in a creative writing class, which everyone had to do in third year. I went to university in Nigeria, a university called the Ogun State University. And my lecturer, for some reason, every time we came to class, when he wanted to kind of pick out a poem to read, he would pick out mine, which I found quite embarrassing.
Aww.
There's really no need for anyone to be targeted in that way. So, yes, so he then kind of called me to the side later and said that he thought that I had some real talent, which was scary as well. And that he thought I should pursue a career in writing. I was 19. All I kind of wanted to do at that time was party. So it wasn't something I was thinking about seriously. And then when I left uni, I joined the Association of Nigerian Authors and learned to, interacted with lots of poets. And it started looking like something that I actually enjoyed. And it came quite easy to me, you know, as opposed to the fiction. Yeah.
And so is that sounds like you had a lot of connection with a lot of writers there at the time, which may have led to your inspiration for starting this incredible festival you've started, the Aké Festival.
Well, that was part, I studied literature. So, you know, you do kind of, we, even in class, we all had our favorite boyfriend authors that we would, every time they were mentioned in class, they'd be like, oh, that's my lover, and stuff like that. So yeah, we knew writers. Of course, we couldn't speak to them if we had to call them.
Do you mean boyfriend authors in the sense that you actually fancied the writers, even though they were long dead?
Yeah, of course. So the dead ones, the ones that were alive, it was just choose who you like, you know, and who you love and care about. So we would all kind of hold them very dearly to our hearts. And, you know, it's, so after I left uni, I was also, through the association, interacting a lot with established writers, with new writers. But I think beyond that, I knew that people having exposure to literature was very important. And I knew also from my experience that it was possible for fiction, especially, to kind of change lives and change the way that people think. And it became increasingly important to me through the years to introduce people to books. So even when I was living in England, I was an English teacher in a few schools in London. And even then, it was a big thing for me in class. I would sit in class and the kids would be coming in and I'd be laughing and laughing and they wouldn't know why. And then I'd eventually say, oh, it's this book. And that book would be out of the library till the end of the term. So yeah, it's always been important. And then to have this opportunity to actually bring writers together on African soil is a huge deal. And it's something that we're all very proud of.
It's a huge deal. And just everybody, just to let you know, I heard Lola talk about her performers last week, and she has such passion for their talents. I'm going to ask you, Lola, to give us, in the short time we've got, just maybe 2 or 3 acts we can't miss next week.
Ooh.
Oh, it's hard.
Lots. But I think it's tough, because we have so many important writers. We've got Tayari Jones, who won the Women's Prize, I think last year. We've got Marlon James, who won the Booker. So we've got some pretty well-known writers. We've got Desmond Cole, who's on the bestseller list in Canada as we speak, as well as a whole lot of incredible writers who are working and living on this continent. I think one thing that might be of interest is what we call the WS20 for 2020. So I had the privilege of speaking to Nobel laureate Lola Shoniyan. And what I asked him to do was to talk about 20 of his favorite artifacts, well, his favorite antiquities collected over a 60-year period. And it was just hearing the backstory and, you know, what was going on in his mind as he bought those little, you know, individual pieces was so fascinating, because in itself, it was like a history lesson. But just on a personal level, just the breadth of the different things that informed his choices, I found really interesting. And I'm sure that you will find that interesting too. There's a piece in the FT about that. I think it's out today or tomorrow. I think the play, it's called Venus versus Modernity, and it's about Zara Bartman. So the woman who was taken away from South Africa and taken to Europe, and she had the big bum, and she was, I mean, you hear people saying Venus Hottentots, that's often said in the, apparently it was all about her. And they say also that those dresses, I can't remember what they're called, but there's this dress that has like, it's rather large. It's like, I mean, wearing like a really massive skirt, but then putting a football in the back region. That again was, that style apparently was inspired by this woman, but she was horribly exploited in some of the places that she went to. She was treated like an animal in the zoo. So this fantastic woman, Lebo Mashile, who's South African, has written a musical, and it's a play with, it's just the two, her and a woman called Anne, who's an opera singer in South Africa, and it's the most incredible performance. I saw it when I was at a Bantu festival about a year ago, and I knew I needed to bring it to Nigeria, not knowing it would be a virtual festival. So yes, we're going to have it. It's going to be available for anyone to see, but it's truly magical. I wonder if I could talk a little bit about also some of the panel. So apart from all those books and the curious about Africa, about African philosophy and African religion.
Lola, we've lost you. Lola, we've lost you for a second. Can you hear me? Lola?
Have you? Am I back with you now?
You're
yes,
back with us now. Give us, we've just got a moment, so quickly tell us.
Yes, I was just going to say we've got amazing panel discussions like Why Africa Needs Feminist Giants with people like Mona El-Tahawi. And we also, something I think is very important to do, interrogate faith all the time. So we have, for instance, a panel discussion called The Place of Faith in a Health Crisis. Of course, giving people an opportunity to reflect on, you know, how the different leaders of religious leaders have responded during this time. Amazing.
So actually, I think Tom's probably going to ask you a question a little bit later about what it's been like in Lagos, but we are, it is time for us to move on to David and Tom's conversation. Do we have time for a quick poem before we do that? Would be up for reading us a poem now, Lola?
Oh.
Or shall we save it till the end?
So I'm going to read one. I could read it now if you like. It's called Buniyadi. I did say that it was a little bit grim, but it's because we woke up one day in 2015 to hear that 69 young boys had been slaughtered in a school in northern Nigeria. And I couldn't sleep for quite a few days. And I wrote this poem called Buniyadi. That's the name of the area. So there will be no glory in this war, no victor, no worn, torn leaves in history books, no praise song for homecoming kings, no applause for the cause, no clanging of swords, no song for the cymbals. When the North is nothing but a scroll on a blackboard and the East is eating the South, the West will pull out its teeth and hold blood in its mouth. Everyone will remember the days when we knew the shoemaker from the brush in hand, the hand in bush, the bush burning the hand at its wrist. Everyone will remember when the school was painted with the blood of 69 boys whose names we never call. Everyone will remember when virgins hanged themselves by their hymens, when 300 girls slept with the snakes of Sambisa forest. For God or for country, the only moral for these mortals is loss. In this lockhorn of cross and crescent, smiths in red loincloths widen the needle's eye for the chalked camel on her dance to the riverbed. Thank you.
Oh, Lola. Everybody unmute and give a big clap for that beautiful, tragic poem.
Right. Very much.
Amazing. Absolutely amazing. Thank you, Lola. And please come back at the end and read us another poem, but also come back and we'll have more time with you at another Drink with the Idler. We really wanted to get Lola on before her festival next week. So we slipped her in today, and we can all catch up on that next week as well. Lola, we'll come back to you later, but for now,
okay.
David Goodhart and Tom.
Hi.
Hello.
I'm going to introduce David Goodhart. Now, David Goodhart, the first thing to say about you and your new book, Head, Hand, Heart, is that you're uniquely well named to write the book because your surname is Goodhart. Now, do you think that the surname of a writer can actually sort of influence the subject matter they choose? That's the first question. But also, then, more seriously, could you just tell us a bit about the previous book, The Road to Somewhere, and the sort of thesis of that, and how this book, which is really about the idea that we need to accord a higher status to what you call hand and heart workers, i.e. people who work with their hands, and also, people who do that very difficult job of caring.
Yeah, I've never really thought about my name in this context. I mean, my heart, I'm afraid, does lack an E. It is H-A-R-T.
So it's more like a good deer.
Well, yeah, or it could have lost its German D, in which case it may just mean, it may be the opposite of good heart. It may be good at being hard.
good and hard.
Yeah. Good, either good and
tough
hard.
guy, basically.
Good at being mean.
Right. Okay. So it might mean the exact opposite of what it appears to mean.
But yeah, no. I mean, on your other question, I mean, I think, yeah, this in a way is. I mean, I think the kind of causes of mass political alienation in our times are sort of staring us in the face. The fact that we've so narrowed the sort of sources of prestige and success in our society, which are essentially, pass exams when you're young, go to a good university and get a prestigious professional career. And they used to be, I mean, the sources of esteem and status used to be much more widely spread, used to be attached to a wider range of human aptitudes, the hand and the heart that I talk about in the title of the book. And I think it has been one of the really significant and sort of underexplored features of liberal modernity, particularly in the last 20 or 30 years with the huge expansion of higher education. And I mean, I talk in the book about what I call the kind of 1550 problem, that when 15% of the people in your class or school or town went to university and you didn't, it didn't really matter. I mean, when I went to university, only about 10 or 15% of the population did. But when 45 or 50% of the population go and you're not in that group, it's a completely different psychological ballgame. And, Tony Blair famously in 1999 gave this speech saying we should send 50% of school leavers into higher education.
It seemed like at the time that seemed like a sort of a good idea, doesn't it? Let's educate everybody. What's wrong with that? What's not to like?
Well, except it's not everybody. I mean, it's educating people in a certain way, and indeed you might say a certain rather limited way. But allocating all the reward and prestige to that way. If you believe in sort of the intelligence researchers will tell you, yes, the IQ bell curve is roughly right. In terms of kind of raw intelligence, there are about 15% of the population who are kind of super bright in a kind of pattern recognition kind of way, and there are probably 15% of the population who are a bit slow. Most of the rest of us are in the middle. So most of the people who go to university are not geniuses. They're of kind of average ability, but, you know, probably like most of us on this call. But there's a certain kind of...
Well, actually, we're slightly superior, most of us, but yeah, I take the point.
But anyway, I mean, you know, this book is very much a follow-on from my last book, The Road to Somewhere, which was exploring the value divides that had led to Brexit and Trump and European populism. And I coined these terms, the people who see the world from anywhere and the people who see the world from somewhere. I invented the terms. I didn't invent the worldviews that sit behind them. I mean, I spent a lot of time with my nose in the British social attitude surveys and other pieces of opinion and value research. And there really are these different blocks. Obviously, they're kind of fuzzy at the edges, and lots of people belong to more than one block at a time, and I was often accused of being very sort of binary, but actually there are lots of different kinds of anywheres, lots of different kinds of somewheres, and there's a big in-betweener group and so on. Anyway, the book was well timed. It was one of the first books that came along at the beginning of 2017 with a sort of generic explanation for what had happened in our politics. And I mean, I did have.
So wasn't this really, you know, to somewheres and anywheres? Isn't a different way of putting it just the, you know, the posh people and the other people? I mean, it's a bit.
No,
no.
I mean, because it's, well, I mean, it's the kind of, I mean, it's the highly educated. I mean, it's the sort of graduate elite. It's the graduate class, and it's a much bigger elite. It's you might say a much more democratic elite than it was when I went to university. And like I say, only about 10% of school leavers did. But I think, I mean, one of the reasons why a lot of people in the sort of Guardian world didn't like the book because they felt that it was pointing the finger at them. You know, they always want to feel, oh, it's rich people and the corporations who are to blame for everything. And I was actually saying, well, no, it's actually also the kind of liberal educated classes. Not that there's anything wrong with the anywhere worldview, nor indeed the somewhere worldview. Both of these worldviews are perfectly decent and legitimate.
But they're a bit sort of myopic.
The problem is one of them has completely dominated our society, our culture, our economy, and left the other lot out, and has not had any respect for the more, you know, the somewhere values of kind of, you know, of security and familiarity and small c conservatism and you know, and love of tradition, these things have been, you know, looked down upon by the people that dominate our culture, and I mean, you know, class overlaps with it to some extent, but I mean, there are rich somewheres and there are plenty of anywheres on relatively modest incomes. So it's much more related to educational level and the kind of worldview associated with that. And partly because, you know, we are global outliers in the proportion of people that we send to residential universities. It's one of the main reasons I think we had Brexit. I mean, it sounds a rather dramatic thing to say, but most countries, I mean, of course, higher education has expanded everywhere in recent decades. And there was a time when it was rational, it was demanded, companies needed it. We were massively expanding the public administration, you know, in the 60s, 70s, 80s. A huge increase in the number of teachers, doctors, university lecturers, and so on.
Yeah, the sort of the liberal elite, as it's called.
Well, the sort of professional class. Yeah. But I mean, in parentheses, one of my arguments now is that it's not only a desirable thing to shift. You know, not only has analytical cognitive ability acquired too much prestige and reward, and drawn away prestige and reward from other clusters of human aptitude. But what's happened now is it's become completely dysfunctional. There was, as we were saying, there was a sort of a point when it made sense, but it's now become dysfunctional. We're hugely overproducing graduates, and we have massive skill shortages in the skilled trades, in middling technical functions, and huge shortages in huge recruitment crises in the caring professions, which are going to have to grow enormously to satisfy the demands of an aging society.
Okay, so the obvious retort is it's not so much a status thing, surely. It's a money thing. I mean, we did see under lockdown that maybe just briefly, but you know, nurses and caring professions their status went up a little bit. You know, we used to joke about how the nightclubs were going to be turning away the celebrities and allowing the nurses in first in the queue, because everyone wanted to say they were friends with an NHS nurse or a doctor or something like that. But then the clapping eventually seemed a bit sort of hollow, and you know, if you want to give someone more status, you give them more money. I mean, the bankers don't do it just for the status; they do it because they're becoming incredibly rich, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, status follows the money to some extent. It's not a precise thing. I mean, there are lots of people, you know, relatively impoverished artists, vicars, you know, people who have high status but relatively little money, and vice versa. You know, a lot of plumbers in London, you know, can earn £100,000 a year if they want to, but that doesn't mean they're in a high status profession. I mean, I think it's not the case. I mean, lots of people who work in the NHS already have, as you say, quite high status and quite high pay. I mean, obviously doctors are well paid, but even nurses in the NHS are not badly paid. I mean, the real Cinderella service is adult social care. I mean,
that's where they get very, very low pay.
Well, I mean, even adults, you know, the managers in adult social care often get perfectly well paid. I mean, as it were, the kind of rank and file carers are often on minimum wage. Domiciliary work, you know, people who go to people's homes are also often on effectively minimum wage jobs.
Haven't we had some of this before? I mean, looking back, okay, well, firstly, isn't it a bit of an ancient issue, really? You know, to sort of go up the social scale, you do less and less low status work, less work with your hands. I mean, you know, in ancient times, Socrates was all about working with your head. You know, if you look at sort of, I don't know, like I think John Adams, the American president, said, you know, I start working with my hands in the farm, so my child can become a doctor, and their child can become a philosopher or something like that. I mean, isn't it quite a sort of natural thing to actually want to escape, you know, sort of grueling hard work?
I mean, when I started writing the book, I had a few weeks at an institute in Vienna, actually, and I showed the first chapter, the kind of overview chapter, to a political philosopher at the institute, and she gave it back to me a couple of days later and said, oh, well, you know, that's quite interesting, but you realise, of course, it's all in Plato.
Yeah.
I did actually then have to read The Republic, which is an incredibly difficult book to read. I don't know how many people here have read The Republic.
Well, by the way, if you haven't read The Republic, then you'll do well to follow Mark Vernon and my online course on the subject.
Oh, really?
You can get on the Idler. Yeah, we did a series of dialogues about Plato.
I mean, most of it is completely unreadable and irrelevant, I think. I mean, all those sort of long passages about sort of aesthetics and anyway. No, I mean, a lot of this goes back to Plato, to classical philosophy, and indeed Christianity. You know, the purity of the mind and thought compared to the sort of corrupt, you know, corruptness of
yeah, and there were the, you know, the monk in the Middle Ages. The monks were supposed to be the ones doing the praying and stuff.
Yeah.
Although, having said that, the monks also set a good example in the Middle Ages for handwork and heart work, because that was also what they did. You know, they looked after the poor people, and they brewed beer and grew vegetables. So,
yeah, but what's different about modern times, Tom, is that we have a mass cognitive elite. Like, you know, 30 or 40% of the population now have degrees. I mean, that doesn't mean to say they're particularly able people. Some of them will be, some of them won't be. I mean, we have. Obviously, you know, you write a book called Head, Hand, Heart, and you're arguing essentially that head has claimed too much reward and prestige. People are sort of saying, "Well, so you're in favour of stupid people and stupidity?" And well, obviously,
we're not giving that argument. No.
But obviously, we do. You know, we need high intelligence more than ever before, because of the various holes we've dug for ourselves. Or the inevitable byproduct of progress has given us an environmental problem. You know, we need clever people to work out how to suck carbon out of the atmosphere and so on. I mean, that goes without saying. And there will always be, you know, a sort of thin layer of highly able people in lots of relevant areas. But what we've done is we've massively expanded higher education. We've produced a sort of great bloated cognitive bureaucracy of people, many of whom are no more able than the people that don't go to university.
Yeah, so it's a bit like the sort of Dickensian situation, these sort of ridiculous departments of well, bullshit jobs, more or less.
Yeah, well, we're all Jude the Bloody Obscure. I mean, we've all been we have this kind of a ridiculous fantasy of the sort of glory of academic study, and meanwhile we've kind of, but there are bound to be diminishing returns. I mean, the quality of academic product from an average British university now is obviously lower than it was 30 or 40 years ago.
Yeah. And what about bohemianism, or if we go back to Coleridge or William Morris? I mean, Karl Marx said something similar. Why can't we do both? Why can't we sort of philosophize in the morning and chop logs in the afternoon?
No, absolutely, we should do. And of course, everything we do is a combination of head, hand, and heart too. I mean, obviously it's an abstraction. Right now, I mean, we're both being sort of cognitive, emotional, embodied in what we're doing. So there's a constant interaction between, and most things of value involve a large amount of at least two of those sets of aptitudes. But I still think it is worthwhile trying to sort of separate out. I mean, many occupations do have a predominance of one or the other.
So how do we as a sort of culture, or even a sort of global society, give more respect to the carers?
Like I say, it's coming anyway. It's coming because it turns out that the knowledge economy doesn't need very many knowledge workers. This is my whole point about peak head. I mean, when I started writing the book, I thought this is a rather idealistic, even kind of slightly new agey idea, shifting status from, so it's been too monopolized by the exam passers and so on. But actually, the more I read up about the future of work and the future of the labour market, it's absolutely startlingly clear that this is coming anyway, because AI is coming for the middle and lower ends of the kind of cognitive part of the labour market. And if you just look at, so much of our education policy, our social mobility policy, even our sort of productivity policy has been based on a myth, I think, of the ever expanding cognitive class. And it is not going to expand forever. The growth of it has already slowed dramatically. If you look at the ONS has a sort of occupational class schema of, I think it's sort of 7 or 8 classes.
ONS, that's the Office of National Statistics, and all of us can look that up for free online, can't we?
Yeah, absolutely. And the top 2 social classes, essentially the managerial and professional, the upper managerial and professional class, and the kind of lower managerial and professional class. If you look at a surprisingly high number of people are, if you combine the two, if you look back at the year 2000, I think about 35% of the adult working population were in the top 2 social classes. If you looked at the number for this year, it's 36.5 or 37%. I mean, so it's essentially stopped growing. I mean, there was a big expansion, this is the whole sort of meritocracy, social mobility argument, huge expansion in the so-called room at the top, what social mobility researchers call room at the top. But the main reason for social mobility is that there's more professional jobs that people are kind of pulled up into. And when that process slows down, so does social mobility. Because in free societies, it is just, even without private schools, in free societies, your parents are able to hand on their advantages to their children, and they will always do so. So social mobility, meritocracy is always going to be pretty partial and flawed at best. I mean, which is not to say you shouldn't try and be more meritocratic. But so my argument is partly that it's not so much, it's not an argument against meritocracy, it's an argument against a very narrow definition of it, focused on one set of aptitudes, the cognitive one. Let's spread, as it were, our thinking about merit in a more sophisticated way into other areas to do with manual and craft skills, and particularly to do with caring. Mark Vernon was saying earlier about measurement. I mean, one of the reasons why the cognitive meritocracy has swept all before it is because cognitive skills are easy to measure, and it seems to be fair. Everybody reads the same books, we all sit down and we do the same exams, and they're marked more or less fairly, and we produce a hierarchy from that, and that seems to be fair. And to some extent it is. Obviously, some kids are better off than others. They have private tutors and others don't, blah, blah, blah. But it's, you know, and other forms, it's very hard to measure outcomes. It's very hard to measure the work of a nurse working on a geriatric ward in a hospital, making the life of a few old people a little bit better for a few hours. How do you measure that? How do you evaluate that? There are a lot of people in the NHS actually working on how you do that. And I think it's incredibly important that in a sense we want more meritocracy, but we want it in different kinds of fields.
But how do you measure that? Because you know, it's I've seen with, for example, Victoria's mother, who's in her 90s. She has these absolutely wonderful people coming around to look after her, and I mean, it's such a complicated job, and it's so subtle, and they have to be so, you know, their sort of behaviour has to be so sort of nuanced and gentle and so on. And I just think, wow, how do they do that? You know, but it's not really measurable, is it?
Well, why not? I mean, you know, let's find a way of doing it. I mean, you know, if you ask an economist, say, you know, why is it that people in social care homes get, you know, are paid so little? What they would reply, well, because anybody can do it, and we know that that's not true. What they're, this is what I call cognitive creep. They're judging the work done in a care home by the qualifications required to get the job, and the qualifications required to get the job are pretty minimal, indeed, I mean, barely any. So you don't need cognitive qualifications to do it, therefore anyone can do it, therefore it sort of must be simple, is the misleading logic. But of course, you spend 10 minutes in any care home or hospital, and you know, in like any walk of life, there are good carers, there are okay carers, and there are crap carers. But it's very difficult to sort of differentiate. And you know, differentiate in sort of pay and status in the way that it's much easier to do in the sort of, you know, in the cognitive profession,
in the sort of the measurable things, and you know, when you look at the sort of social media today, I mean, that's an insane competition for numbers. You know, you can see exactly how many views you have and so on, and they draw you into this crazy utilitarian competition. But I would like to keep ask you questions sort of forever and have you like next to me all the time as a to give ethical advice on everything that we do. But should we go and do some one last point is there seems to be sort of shades of William Morris a little bit in what you're talking about. You know, people have tried this before, haven't they? William Morris, Ruskin and so on, they were saying, you know, let's praise bread baking and the scythe man and so on. But it's quite a difficult job.
It will come back though, because so much of the basic work will be done either by the robots. You know, a lot of manual work has already been automated, and an increasing amount of intellectual work, cognitive work, is now being automated or will be in the future. So the things that won't be subject to robots will be face-to-face services and care services, education and care. Virtually all of us are going to be working in, except for those people who are producing sort of, you know, artisanal bread or artisanal beer, or, you know, or special kinds of products of various kinds.
Yeah, the men with beards and brown aprons in Shoreditch.
Yeah, exactly.
Those guys, yeah. Well, yeah. Victoria, should we have some questions?
Yeah, please. Ian, will you see if your mic works? You've got a good question, and then we'll have Claudia be ready to ask, and Julian. Ian, are we going to be able to hear you? Doesn't sound like it. He thought that his question wasn't going to work. What Ian was asking...
Yeah, I was going to say, can't he write it down and then...
Yeah, he's written it down. I can ask it for him.
Right.
What are your thoughts, David, on the impact coronavirus will have on decades of neoliberal small state thinking in the UK? Which way do you think we will go in the post-COVID world?
I don't know. Is it Ian who was asking the question?
Yeah,
Ian has been living, but we've had. We have a Conservative government that's been massively increasing public spending, even prior to the pandemic. I mean, no one cares about balancing the books any longer, and just as well, because they're not balanceable, at least not for a very long time. No, we have essentially a kind of social democratic Conservative government, at least when it comes to public spending. And I think that's rather a good thing. And I think the two things that have come, the two sort of political impulses from the pandemic, I think one has been quite a small c conservative one, in that it's kind of, it's reinforced the nation state. I mean, it's not been a great pandemic for international institutions. It's further slowed down or even reversed to some extent globalization. We found that PPE was being manufactured all over the world. It won't be in future. We'll manufacture PPE at home. It's also been, I think, in a way, sort of quite good for the family and domesticity. I mean, obviously it's had its dark side. There will have been an increase in abuse and so on. But I mean, all the surveys I've seen, and anecdotally, I mean, my kids are all in their 20s and have sort of fled the nest. But I mean, most of the surveys I've seen have and indeed talking to parents with younger children about how there's been a sort of renaissance of family life in some ways. People have kind of got to know their kids again. I've heard several people saying that. Now, it hasn't always been a happy story, obviously. Getting to know your kids can be a bit of a shock.
We've all got to know each other very well. It's been a complete nightmare.
But getting to know...
It was better when we didn't know each other so well.
Feeling more rooted in places, again, as Mark was talking about earlier. I mean, noticing... I mean, there's a kind of old lady who lives up the road who I've been taking out for a walk, who I didn't know the existence of until, I was on one of these sort of local volunteer apps. Think of all the tens, hundreds of thousands of kind of WhatsApp groups that have sprung up all over the country to allow people to look after each other. So I think that. Yeah,
but Dave, we know all that stuff. But what about the fact that all the big companies on the stock exchange are getting bigger and bigger, and their share prices are going up. Small businesses are closing all over the country. Pubs are closing. And there's going to be a sort of massive increase in unemployment, particularly among perhaps the people that you're talking about.
Well, no, I mean, Ian was asking about neoliberalism. I mean, this is the least neoliberal conservative government that's ever existed. Well, I mean, certainly since the war. And look at the extraordinary way in which we've, collectively underwritten the livelihoods of very large proportions of the workforce. I think the other impulse. So there's the small c conservative sort of communitarian one, but there's also a very strongly social democratic one. And I think both of those impulses are rather good ones in many ways. I mean, obviously it's wreaked a lot of damage, but I think also in the way that it's sort of helped to dissolve to some extent the divide between the public realm and the private realm. I mean, with people working from home a lot more. I mean, we've sort of we've recognised and perhaps come to a new appreciation of the importance of domesticity. And indeed, one of the themes of my book is, how if you're trying to raise the status of care in the public care economy, and you're trying to deal with this crisis of recruitment we have in nursing jobs and social care, then I think to some extent you also have to raise the status of care in the private realm, in the realm of the family. And that then raises that sort of gets into quite difficult areas of modern feminism, the extent to which modern feminism is very much focused on sort of career feminism, of equality with men in competition with men in the sort of professional sphere. Now, and obviously that's completely fair and right, but it's sort of tended to sort of diminish, I think, the care done, still the vital amount of care done in the private realm. It's all about, modern family and gender policy is all about, both parents, escaping from the home as soon as possible. And actually, if you look at all the surveys, I mean, most people with young children would like it to be easier to stay at home, at least until children are of school age. And the state in this country does remarkably little, I mean, even compared to other comparable countries, to make it easy for at least one parent, it'll usually be the mother, not always, to stay at home when children are very young, rather than having to rush out back to work again. And I don't know, and I think it may be that the pandemic will sort of contribute to an upward revaluation. How do we upwardly revalue domesticity in an era of gender equality as well? I mean, I think that's a fascinating issue. And also, how do we get one of the reasons we have recruitment crises in so many of the care professions is because women, I mean, it's a benign reason, it's because women have so many options now that they didn't have in my mother's generation. 40 or 50 years ago, most able women only really had the option of becoming a teacher or a nurse. And now their children are kind of running the world. They're partners in city law firms or whatever. I mean, the public services used to get an amazing free lunch from sort of incredibly able women who, like I say, now would be sort of, running the CBI or whatever, who were running primary schools. And so...
Well, so hang on, you're saying there's been a decline in public services because the very able women are now...
Yeah. I mean, it's a very difficult thing to measure, but yeah. We spend God knows how many more billions on public services, and often you feel that they were better 50 years ago. And if they were, this is probably one of the reasons. Because actually the glass ceiling, or from the point of view of society as a whole, and obviously from the point of view of women, it's good that the glass ceiling was broken, but it created a huge free lunch for the public services. But the conundrum now is, so women are not volunteering for caring jobs to the same proportion they used to, partly because they had fewer options, and men have not been stepping into the breach. So I think one of the really interesting issues is how do we get men to move? I mean, NHS nursing is 88% female. Primary schools are 85% female. Social care is 82% female. How do we increase the proportion of men going into these areas? I think is one of the I mean, should we be incentivizing it in some ways? Creating more kind of role models. And I mean, although having said that, one of the problems is that in nursing, for example, we have the opposite of a glass ceiling. We have a so-called glass escalator. So men tend to dominate all the top positions in nursing.
Well, let's go on to another couple more questions, Victoria, shall we?
Yeah, we've got Claudia waiting, and hopefully there'll be time for Julian after you, Claudia. You there, Claudia?
Yes, I am. Thanks so much to Lola and David for talking with us tonight. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Yeah, we can see you very well with your strange bunny ears.
Mordy, are you there?
They're cat ears, but...
Can you just get my computer charger?
So my question for David is, my husband is a self-taught computer scientist worker, and I have 2 master's degrees. And so I'm just wondering what you think about the computer techie folks now. They've come up the chain, self-taught, making a living. My husband still makes more money than I, even though I have 3 degrees and he has a high school diploma. No diss to him, but he's all self-taught, and he's been able to make a living with that. And now I'm an international high school counselor, and I have students this year who are applying to universities such as Cambridge for computer science, because it's much more, organized, and it's a degree now. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on the transformation of the realm of the computer scientist degrees and educational chain that's happening with that industry over the years.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. I don't know myself a huge amount about computer science, but I mean, I think we are starting to see, if you look at the labour market, if you look at the signals that the labour market is sending, there is clearly an understanding that we've overproduced people with kind of narrowly academic skills, and you now get, partly because of the shortages in non-academic engineering, non-academic IT professionals. I mean, there's a huge premium, and research by the National Institute for Economic and Social Research finds that sort of technician type jobs are considerably better paid than a very large proportion of graduate jobs. Nonetheless, the system, I mean, it's also no surprise that most parents still want their children to go to university, because 40% of jobs in the economy, and most of the best ones, are graduate only. So, and there aren't that many people like your partner or husband who do that well without university degrees these days. I mean, he's a bit of an outlier. Although I think I think sort of history is moving in his direction to some extent. And I think what we will see, what I hope we'll see in a way, is we concentrate a ridiculous amount of public educational spend on sending 18, 19-year-olds into very expensive higher education. Particularly in this country, it's very expensive because it's overwhelmingly residential as well. And it's such a waste of money in many cases. You know, I speak as someone who has 4 kids in their 20s, all of whom have been through the university system. And I think you know, I mean, it would be far better, I think, to do, say, you know, on the subject of computer science, you know, to do a coding course, you know, spend £6,000 doing a coding course. You know, you leave school at 18, you do, you know, relatively sort of straightforward job in software or coding or whatever. And then, you know, if you get really interested in the subject, you want to know kind of what lies behind what you're doing, go and do a computer science degree and understand, you know, the kind of deeper logic of what's going on. And you'll be much more interested, you'll be a much better student, you'll get far more out of it yourself. You know, just, I mean, you know, the millions of, hundreds of thousands of kids who go to college 18, 19, just because it's the rite of passage, it's the obvious thing to do. And of course it's fun as well. I mean, you know, 3 years away from mum and dad, being partly funded by the state. I mean, you know, why wouldn't you want to do that? And, you know, the kind of networks you make that end up being very important in your later life, possibly. And it is, you know, there is something very, you know, can be very creative. You get to know people from different backgrounds and different ethnicities these days too. And that's, you know, that can be, you learn how to do kind of political things. You know, you set up a student society, you learn how to organise a meeting, etc. But what I would like to see, those kinds of things made available to people who don't want to do the full 3-4 year academic thing. And we are going to, you know, this government is certainly determined to try and shift, you know, I mean, you know, we've had so little decent on offer in terms of post-school education apart from university. You know, the whole technical vocational the whole apprenticeship system has been dramatically diminished in the last 20 or 30 years. Now, and there are now attempts to do something about that. This government is talking about investing much more in the FE system. It's those sort of level 4, level 5 skills. You know, level 3 is A level, level 6 is a bachelor's degree.
David, are you hopefully advising the government, because we need some of these policies coming through?
Yeah,
but,
David, maybe you could advise the government to tell everyone to just join the Idler Academy, because if you took all our courses, you'd be a very well-rounded person.
Right.
You would. We've got 60 of them, and the Dickens one this week, of course. So everybody look them up. And talking about culture, David, thank you so much. We're going to have to round that part of the evening up now. But Lola, could we have one more poem from you before we round up? Have we lost Lola? No, you're there. Hooray. Brilliant.
No, I'm here. I've been listening the whole time, just enjoying the conversation. So this one I'm reading, this is one for the ladies. And like I said earlier, it's we went through the lockdown, many of us on lockdown, and in Nigeria, this part of the world, a lot of us kind of became less familiar with the bra. And suddenly when we were all back to work, it was very, very difficult to start wearing one again. So that reminded me of this old poem that I wrote maybe 20 years ago. It's called Blessed Brazier. So I've had this war with the bra for a long time. Blessed underwire, my bosom is at rest. Yea, I am more confident with steel at my chest. For my boobs are now pointing, not southwards, but west. I, in my brassiere, am happy and blessed.
Well, we've come to a very light touch. We've finished on the light touch. Everybody have a really good clap for Lola and David. Please unmute, and we've got a song as well.
Brilliant presentation.